Okay, chapter 8 of the NASM 7th edition personal training certification textbook. And chapter 8 is all about exercise metabolism and bioenergetics, one of my favorite topics. Again, as always, when we do these chapter studies, please make sure that you have paper, something to write with, your pen or your pencil. Read, write, recite. It's critical that you study in this way if you're unsure of how to actually memorize material. Critical that you are writing the material down. And as we're going through this chapter in particular, as a couple of the previous chapters, not all of them, but a couple of the previous chapters, there's a fair amount of terminology, and NASM does that to get you prepped so that you can deal with the material, the more sort of hands-on real world material that you're going to be dealing with when they go through the OPT model. But you're going to notice as you go through, and by the way, chapter 8, not the thickest chapter, but it's an important one to know. And there's a lot of terminology here that you'll want to be aware of, and writing down, rewriting, and making sure you're familiar with it. So exercise metabolism and bioenergetics normally starts off with the understanding of this molecule, high energy molecule called ATP. If you're not familiar with it, adenosine triphosphate, it's the fundamental energy unit of life on Earth. And so it is the basic unit of energy that the body uses at a cellular metabolic level. Anything that drives or requires energy uses ATP as this high energy triphosphate bonded molecule, and it's the third phosphate coming off of this linear adenosine uh, base part of the molecule, with a single phosphate bonded to a second phosphate and then bonded to a third phosphate. Therefore, it's called adenosine triphosphate. It's the breaking of that third phosphate group off of the molecule itself. I think it's just easier if I kind of show you ATP, what it kind of looks like molecularly in one sense. So there's an adenosine, what we call an adenosine backbone, with a single, double, and then triphosphate. And that's basically what it looks like. So there's your adenosine with your PO4. PO4 is the chemical way we write phosphate. So you have an adenosine and 1, 2, 3 triphosphate, right? So the high energy molecule, the high energy bond, right? This relatively unstable bond is between the second and the third, phosphate. So if you can chemically cleave or break that bond, right, between the second and the third phosphate, it releases energy, right? And you are then left with a adenosine backbone and two phosphates, and that would be called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Not the most challenging concept. Of course, it's exceedingly more complicated at a biochemical level, but that's really the point here with understanding ATP, is that it's the high energy molecule that really is the fundamental molecule of life on Earth at a cellular level. So understanding ATP in this respect helps us to understand some of the concepts behind bioenergetics, right? And ultimately, in some way, shape, or form, everything we eat, aside from maintenance and building of muscle tissue, things like that, the goal is to get the conversion of food substrates into ATP. And so there's different ways that your body, in particularly in the muscles is what we're talking about. There are specific ways your body gets ATP. Um, and it's based on environmental conditions and what's needed at a particular time. So that's basically what chapter 8 is going to be really going over. So bioenergetics and metabolism, you got a definition there. Introduction to the law of thermodynamics. If you don't remember, the first law of thermodynamics basically says that energy in any way, shape, or form can never be destroyed. It only gets converted and redirected in another shape or form. So electrical energy, for instance, can be converted. It's never destroyed, but it can be converted into mechanical energy. It can be converted into chemical energy can be converted into mechanical energy. And by the way, that's basically what happens. The cross bridges in the actin and myosin molecules. Remember, we talked about that. Those cross bridges of the myosin head that attaches to the actin, that's created, right? That's mechanical energy, and that's occurring because of ATP. When ATP allows for that head of that myosin to actually break away, and then come back and attach again, and this process goes on and on. That comes from ATP. ATP we get from the foods we eat that get converted into the multiple substrates within the body. So obviously the idea then with the law of thermodynamics is it just gives us an understanding that the chemical energies that are found in food, right? So you eat food, there's chemical energy in food that gets converted into other forms of energy. Ultimately, through the conversion into ATP, allows for the mechanical actions of muscle contractions, and that all occurs at a cellular metabolic level. So fuel for energy metabolism on page 228. Where does the fuel come to create metabolism and allow for living entities, cells in our case, right, muscle cells, to function properly? And it comes from what we call substrates, and substrates are basically they're the intermediate forms between the food we eat and the ATP that gets produced. And there's a couple of them: glucose, glycogen, and by the way, glycogen, muscle and liver glycogen are just storage forms of glucose. Free fatty acids are, right, fat can be a substrate for the energy systems in our body. Amino acids can be used, right? And that's what we're going to be kind of going through here in the chapter. NASM gives you some insight a little bit into what's known as the ventilatory threshold, VT1, VT2. They don't hit on it too much here, but they just want you to know that ventilatory threshold is really a respiratory variable that we look at during cardiovascular training. But what they want you to know is that VT1 and VT2 is also strongly related, directly related to fuel usage. So your body can use glucose as a source of fuel. It can also use free fatty acids as a source of fuel. So basically, carbohydrates that are ingested get converted ultimately into glucose. The fats that you eat ultimately get broken down into free fatty acids, triglycerides. And so the free fatty acids are what are going to provide a source of fuel as well as glucose. And that depends on the type of activity, the duration of the activity, things like that. Normally, when we look at fuel usage, we look at the percent of glucose that's producing ATP and the percent of fat, free fatty acids that are producing ATP. And so the idea is that at the ventilatory threshold 1, where we see this non-linear increase in respiration, that's due to the sort of balancing of glucose and free fatty acids as a source of fuel during exercise. When you're not exercising, you're watching this video, I'm sitting here speaking to you, the predominant source of fuel, right, the substrate, is fat, right? The level of intensity of the activities, muscular activities that I'm going through right now are low intensity, right? I'm not doing anything. I'm not exercising. I'm not running, which requires a lot more energy. Well, at low intensity metabolic activity, i.e., basically your everyday life, you're not doing anything, you're walking, right? Very low intensity. The predominant or the majority of fuel is coming from free fatty acids. And so as you start to exercise and you get on a treadmill and you start to increase your heart rate and your demand for more ATP, the percentage of glucose as a source of fuel to working muscles starts to go up, and the percent of fat starts to go down at about 50%, where 50% of the ATP production is coming from glucose metabolism and the other half is coming from fat. We hit a point where basically you have to breathe a little bit deeper. And we know that that's a crossover point, right? Where 50% and 50%, right? Glucose and fat is being used as a source of fuel. Now, if I keep increasing the level of intensity of activity, in other words, I increase the incline of the treadmill, or I increase the speed and I start breathing harder and harder and my heart rate goes up, I'm going to get to a point where free fatty acid usage as a percent of ATP production or metabolism is occurring starts to get really, really low. And then the predominant source of fuel becomes glucose. As we get to that point, we're simply not going to be able to train any harder. And we're going to be breathing real hard. I'm not even going to be able to speak. I'm breathing so hard. At that point, basically where glucose becomes the predominant source of fuel, and that's what you're going to see here, we reach what's known as ventilatory threshold 2. Depending on your level of fitness and training capacity, that's also going to occur. This substrate usage is also going to be concurrent with a percent of your max heart rate of about 90 or so percent, 85, 90%, somewhere around there, you're going to hit what we call ventilatory threshold 2. Again, there are other variables that are in play here, but that's basically what your NASM is trying to help you to understand, is that at VT2, glucose is the predominant source of fuel that's generating the ATP. Now, free fatty acids, of course, can be used and are predominantly used as a source of fuel during low intensity activity. And so what they're basically letting you know here is that free fatty acids is a main substrate. In fact, right now, the majority of the ATP being produced in my body, as well as yours, or in muscles, let's just stick with muscles, is coming from free fatty acids, or what people just say fat, right? But it's free fatty acids. So that's important to understand. Keep in mind, at the bottom of page 229, we realize amino acids are also at the bottom of page 229. You'll see amino acids. In other words, protein is a substrate as a source of fuel. It's just not a primary substrate. The body would prefer not to use it because to break down proteins into amino acids is not an issue. That's what your digestive system does. It's when you have amino acids that now have to be deaminated, right? The amino acids have to have the nitrogen component pulled off. Amino means amine, or amine group is a nitrogen containing molecule, and that's what makes amino acids unique amongst the three macronutrients, proteins, is that they contain nitrogen. Nasty when it needs to be removed and eliminated from the body, but the amine group on the amino acids needs to be removed, right? Deaminated. That's where the term comes from, and the body doesn't like to do that if it doesn't have to. It takes a fair amount of energy and produces waste products that are toxic to the body. So carbs and fats, of course, right, in the form of glucose and free fatty acids, are relatively easier, quote, cleaner to burn, I guess you could say, than amino acids. But the body will use amino acids as a source of fuel if it needs to, under stressed conditions. Another substrate, of course, that today is big in the marketplace is our ketone bodies, right? And I say big in the marketplace because of the ketogenic diet. And your body will use, by the way, ketone bodies are a normal source of fuel at specific times, and during and under specific conditions. If you don't eat enough calories in your diet, low calorie diets, so where it doesn't matter what you're eating, it's just low calories, what the body will do is it will start to produce ketone bodies, which are essentially byproducts of fat metabolism. So fat stores will be broken down through the liver. Ketone bodies can be created to satisfy the need for the production of ATP. It's normal for the body to do that. Under stress conditions, your body needs to be able to get the necessary ATP to get the brain to function right, the blood to pump through the body, all those necessary metabolic activities. And so ketone bodies are a normal part of the metabolic ATP production process. It's just that the way we do it today is we put our, from the ketogenic diet perspective, is we put ourselves into what's called nutritional ketosis. This is where the term comes from. So ketosis or nutritional ketosis is accomplished by eating enough calories through fats and proteins, but reducing carbohydrate intake. That's one of the ways to do it. You can also, by the way, they're on the market. You can buy them. You can literally buy ketones, right? You go into one of the supplement stores and you can buy ketones and you can consume ketones. So when they go in, it's kind of like consuming a glucose drink. If you wanted to drink a carbohydrate source to get more glucose in your body, well, you can actually consume ketones from supplement companies. Individuals with type 1 diet, by the way, that's where the one of the problems comes in, is if you have type 1 diabetes, you have poor glycemic control and you have issues with insulin. In other words, your body doesn't produce enough insulin. And therefore, glucose regulation is basically uncontrolled. You can't regulate glucose levels, type 1 diabetics. And so they will produce ketone bodies, and they will actually go into, if they're not careful, they will go into ketosis, which is not unhealthy to go into ketosis, but they can then move into a dangerous, lethal condition known as a ketoacidosis, and that can actually kill you. So it's type 1 diabetics that, if it does happen and they don't maintain glycemic control, can actually go into ketoacidosis. We don't normally see that with people that are on the ketogenic diet, but again, the point is that ketone bodies can be used as it's a fine source of fuel. By the way, the brain uses it, has no issue, no problem using it. So the point is that on page 230, that finishes up the substrates. Now we move into energy and mechanical work, which leads us into the concept of energy systems. And there are 3 basic energy systems that you need to know. They are the ATP-PC system, right? So the ATP-PC, or phosphocreatine, or you can call it creatine phosphate, the ATP-PC system, right? ATP-PC system, right? I think you can see that, right? That's one way that your body can, it's one system that generates ATP through the usage of substrate. You get how this works? Is that you're eating food, it gets converted into substrates. These substrates are glucose, glycogen, free fatty acids, ketone bodies, amino acids. They can all be used to generate ATP. It's under specific conditions that we see some of them. And so how do ketone bodies, how does glucose, how does glycogen and free fatty acids, how do they move from that state of being a substrate ultimately into ATP? That's what we're talking about. So ATP-PC system, the glycolytic system, or anaerobic glycolysis, and then the oxidative systems, or what's known as oxidative phosphorylation. And within that system, we have what's known as the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain or electron transport system, but we'll get into that. And but look, the goal is to know the three systems and what the timing is, how fast and how long can you get ATP production in these three different systems. And so the first one we look at is the ATP PC system. And from a state of rest into activity, your body already has a small supply, but already small supply of ATP in the form of adenosine diphosphate and phosphocreatine, which is already in the muscle. So you basically have an immediate supply of ATP because of what's normally found within the cytoplasm of the cell. And so the ATP PC system provides energy, muscular output, provides energy in the form of ATP production for about 10 to 15 seconds. That's kind of the number we use. It could be longer, it could be a little shorter, depending on the person. Remember, these are all generalities. And so about 10 to 15 seconds of immediate activity is going to be supplied. ATP is going to be supplied by the ATP PC system. Basically, what happens is ADP, like I showed you, is going to acquire another phosphate from the surrounding pool of creatine phosphate. You hear that word? Creatine phosphate. So the phosphate, that third phosphate molecule that's going to be needed to create this high energy bond is already there, available, but it's connected molecularly, chemically connected to a creatine backbone. And so just like the adenosine backbone has these phosphates to it, creatine can be chemically connected to phosphate as well. And so the creatine phosphate molecule essentially sacrifices itself, right? Sacrifices that phosphate, gives it over to the ADP, and now you have, voila, ATP. But guess what happens? As soon as it becomes ATP, it becomes ADP again and releases energy. So it's just back and forth. Think of like a tennis match, back and forth. ADP becomes ATP, right? The serve goes over. That ATP molecule doesn't stay ATP for very long. It's very unstable. That high energy bond, right, once it's broken again, releases energy. So you have an ADP molecule, now becomes ATP. Boom, energy is released. Back and forth, back and forth. And the carrier of those phosphates is creatine. That's kind of the way it works. That's about as simple an explanation as I think I can get it. The point is that this process is happening over and over and over, just constantly. Now, what happens after 15 seconds? That's what you're asking. What happens after 15 seconds? Well, now you got to have another system that can continue, because that ATP PC system is going to run out as you continue to increase intensity of the activity. It's going to run out, and you need another system to continue to supply ATP. Well, that comes in the form of what's known as the glycolytic or anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means without oxygen, and glycolysis is this glycolytic process of converting glucose through a number of intermediate steps into ATP. And you can read through what those processes are. My recommendation is that don't get too caught up in the minutia of what the glycolytic system process looks like. It's relatively straightforward, because all it's doing is it's taking glucose molecules, it's breaking them into other more intermediate substrates that will allow for the production of ATP. Without oxygen, glucose gets converted or broken into, and you'll see it here in figure 8.5, into what's known as pyruvate. And again, you don't want to get too much in the weeds on this, but the pyruvate ultimately is going to create lactate. The glycolytic system produces this byproduct of pyruvate and ATP. And that's really as in depth as you need to get. So from here, glycolysis will provide enough ATP. Depending on the person, the numbers are roughly about a minute. Could be a little bit longer than that, but roughly up to about a minute. People that are really well trained can use their glycolytic systems for up to 2 minutes. The research is very clear on this, is that for some individuals, it's 30 seconds, others it's 45. We're not going to quibble over those numbers. What we're basically saying is that for the first 10 to 15 seconds, you got one system. For the next 30 to 60, a minute or so, your body is using the glycolytic system. Now, what happens once you develop the byproducts and there's no longer really ATP production capability? What's going to be through the oxidative system. And the oxidative system is what's known as oxidative phosphorylation, 50-cent term. Basically, it's using oxygen, right? Oxidative phosphorylation. And because you're using oxygen, that changes the dynamics. It changes the dynamics of how much ATP can be produced. Basically, it's like I like to think of it like a sponge, right? So fill a sponge with water. The ATP PC system is kind of like, and the water coming out is ATP, right? So if you squeeze it a little bit, you get a couple of drops of water, right? If you squeeze it a little bit more, you get glycolysis and there's some more ATP. Oxidative phosphorylation is kind of like squeezing that sponge and getting all of the ATP out that you can from the same amount of glucose that you started with, just as a for instance. So oxidative phosphorylation utilizes oxygen in these different subsystems to produce ATP. So the oxidative system works just on the outside and then within and inside the mitochondria of the cell. If you remember mitochondria from your biology days, you remember it was called the powerhouse of the cell. Why? Because that's where the majority of ATP production occurs, in the mitochondria of the cell. This is where we see what is called the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain or electron transport system. The point behind this is that now we have the ability metabolically to continue the production of ATP for the most part, as long as there's enough substrate and as long as there's oxygen present, you have an endless supply of ATP. Think about the fact that you are alive and that you live every minute of every hour of every day. You stay alive. Why? Because at rest, your body utilizes, in the muscular system in particular, utilizes the oxidative system. 99.9% of your time on Earth being alive, your body is using this oxidative system. It's only when you go to the gym or you climb stairs and you start lifting weights that your body shifts over into an increase in glucose usage to produce ATP, and your body will shift into the glycolytic systems without oxygen in order to get more ATP production. But the price you pay is fewer molecules of ATP for the same amount of glucose. So basically, your body can run through the oxidative systems, for forever, so to speak, right? And then as you need higher levels of ATP because you're exercising, your body then will shift into increasing, right? Free fatty acid will shift into increasing the percentage of usage of glucose to produce ATP. And so that's what the, the electron transport chain basically does. Now, the way free fatty acids get into the act here, the way they're pulled in, is through what's known as beta oxidation. So that's a key term to remember, because beta oxidation is sort of this roundabout side door way in which free fatty acids will get into this oxidative system. Remember, free fatty acids are used in the presence of oxygen, right? The oxidative system. And they're going to move into that system, into the electron transport chain, through what's known as beta oxidation. That's basically free fatty acids getting molecularly broken down to provide what's known as acetyl coenzyme A, which is the main substrate that will go through the electron transport chain to produce ATP. So during exercise, however, and that's what you're seeing here on page 238, is this explanation of free fatty acids as a source of fuel versus glucose carbohydrates as a source of fuel. So as the level of intensity of an exercise, like a weightlifter, as that intensity shifts from high intensity resistance training, for instance, to a marathon runner, the total percentage of free fatty acids is going to, as a source of fuel, will increase, right? Marathon runners use a lot of body fat that get converted into free fatty acids versus powerlifters who use very little body fat as their sources of fuel, right? They use predominantly glycogen stores and glucose. So that's the idea here with figure 8-9. So metabolism during steady state exercise, however, also is important to understand, because once I get on a treadmill and start training at 3.5 elevation, and I kick it up to whatever 5.5, 6.0 on the treadmill, and I'm running at 7 miles per hour, whatever the number is. The point is that if I maintain that, the percentages don't change for steady state aerobic. However, once I move into changes in intensity during my workout, or what would be termed intermittent work, and you'll see that on page 239. Now the body has to shift into glycolytic mode and recover in oxidative mode. Glycolytic, right? Oxidative. We call this high intensity interval training. If you've heard the term HIIT training, this is the concept. This is where it comes from. As I do hard, intense work, the percentage of glucose as a source of fuel goes higher and higher. And now I rest, and my body goes into a recovery phase, right? This sort of interval, high intensity, and then a recovery phase. And as that happens, you start to develop a increased need, right, for oxygen once that exercise regimen, once that training is complete. This leads us to what's known as EPOC, or excess post-exercise excess oxygen consumption. Excess post-exercise oxygen, EPOC or EPOC. And basically EPOC is the body's normal normalizing of recovery back to a normalized state of just where you are right now. Look, your body wants to get to this state always. So when you exercise really hard, your body has to recover and get back down to this steady state condition where your predominant source of fuel is going to be body fat. Well, what HIIT training basically does is it forces and demands an increased level of post-exercise oxygen consumption to ensure that there's an increased level of ATP to get your body back to a steady rested state. Basically what EPOC is. Now, of course, the figure 8-10 shows you basically what that looks like post-exercise and during exercise. And so we recommend, for instance, using HIIT training as a way to kind of increase overall metabolic activity after you exercise. You may have heard of the term the afterburn. That's what EPOC basically is. And so the afterburn means that you're still burning a lot of calories, a lot of energy, even after you're done exercising. So this is where we talk about estimating fuel contribution during activity. And if you look at figure 8-11, that basically gives you the percentages, the percent of distribution of substrate usage. And you can read that, get a good idea. It's basically giving you a visual explanation of what what is already written. And then the myth of the fat burning zone. I will say this, it's probably one of the best things that you can take from this chapter, is helping clients understand that there is no special way to burn more body fat from any type of training. The idea with the fat burning zone is that the percentage of calories being used will always come from fat, predominantly when you're exercising at a low intensity. The kicker is that you're just not burning a whole lot of calories. So the total number of calories that I'm burning right now as I'm doing this video is very low. It's very low, maybe 3 calories per hour, something, I don't know, whatever the number is, but it's very low. Now, probably 90 to 95% of those calories are coming from free fatty acids. But as soon as I exercise, what's the total number of calories being used? It's significantly higher, but there's a percent change in the substrate being used. And that's why it's a myth. You're not burning more fat, you're burning a higher percentage, but the total caloric expenditure is low. Table 8.1 has just summarized everything we just talked about and what you're going to read. You should memorize table 8.1. It's very important that you get these systems down, got them in the back of your head, because it helps when you move through into the OPT model. And of course, table 8.2 is going to be something similar. Daily energy needs. Nazem is going to hit on some of the things that we normally talk about during nutrition and exercise, things like that. But it's a good idea to talk about it now, because we're talking about energy needs and the production of ATP. And so the idea that total daily energy expenditure is broken up into these different variables is now what we're moving into on page 242. So you've got some definition in calories, kilocalories, and the concept of resting metabolic rate. If you've ever heard of basal, BMR, basal metabolic rate, they are, in one sense, they're not the same thing, but they are the same thing from a calculation standpoint. The only difference between RMR, resting metabolic rate, and what has always been termed basal metabolic rate is the way it's tested. And so basal metabolic rate, you can't have anything to eat. The researchers will have you stay overnight in a testing facility, and then they do the testing and the caloric consumption usage after a night of rest with no food in your stomach. Resting metabolic rate is a little less stringent in its calculation, but RMR is more in line with the way people are being tested at this point. So resting metabolic rate is a less stringent way of testing for the total number of calories needed just to keep you alive, to keep your heart pumping, your nails and your hair growing, all of the basic metabolic functions. So that calculation accounts for the significant amount of calories that your body needs at rest, hence resting metabolic rate. But there's also the thermic effect of food. And by the way, these are all calculated, added together to give you your TDEE, or your total daily energy expenditure. The thermic effect of food simply describes those number of calories required for digestion, right? And so when you eat food, there's a lot of energy. Well, I say a lot, but there's a fair amount of energy needed to break the food down and absorb it. That's called the thermic effect of food. And then there's the energy that you expend during physical activity. This is structured exercise. This is when you're weight training, when you're running. This is activities that are structured. You've defined them in your day. You're going to do A, B, C, and D. So that's what we call your energy expended during physical activity. So physical activity level, or PAL. And then there's going to be energy that's expended outside of, right, unstructured activity. And once you add all of that together, that basically calculates or can be totaled up to give you what you see on 242, your daily energy needs, or your total daily energy expenditure. And so as you move through this chapter, remember there's a fair amount of information that needs to be memorized, Remember, and by the way, metabolic equivalence, METs, that's just a measure of activity, right? You can quantify your activity level. You see it on cardio equipment, for instance, metabolic equivalence. We normally use that in research to give a better estimation of energy output. So you can read, for instance, that getting technical little box that's in there to learn about METs. Go through your summary, your chapter review, of course, and then go through your chapter headlights. Chapter 8 is a very interesting chapter. It's very helpful if you can memorize the terminology, understand the concepts. Again, it's very helpful once you move into the actual training process, because you'll understand how people are functioning and what type of energy substrates are being used during the particular activities that they're using. So that's the end of chapter 8. And again, as always, I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter, which will be, in this case, chapter 9.